Or, nurses dismissed the old medic's techniques until a mass casualty event proved him right. Asked Olf. St. Catherine's Regional Medical Center sprawled across 3 city blocks in downtown Indianapolis, a modern facility with glass facades and technology that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. The emergency department occupied the entire ground floor of the West Wing, 30 beds, state-of-the-art monitoring systems, digital charting, and a trauma bay equipped to handle anything short of a war zone. Henry Garrett reported for his shift at 6 a.m., just as he had every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for the past 18 months. He was 71 years old, though his movements carried the efficiency of someone much younger. He was lean and weathered, with close-cropped silver hair and hands marked by old scars, burns, cuts, the faded remnants of injuries accumulated over decades. He wore standard hospital scrubs in navy blue, a laminated ID badge clipped to his pocket identifying him as Henry Garrett, patient care technician. Not a nurse, not a doctor, a tech. The bottom of the medical hierarchy, responsible for vitals, patient transport, stocking supplies, and the 100 small tasks that kept an emergency department functioning. He gathered his equipment for morning rounds, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, pulse oximeter, and began moving through the department with quiet efficiency. Room by room, patient by patient, checking vitals, making small talk, noting anything that seemed off. In room 7, he found a young man, maybe 25, complaining of abdominal pain. The nurse assigned to the case, Amanda Chen, was a recent graduate, confident and competent, working through her assessment with the systematic thoroughness they taught in nursing school. Pain scale 1 to 10, Amanda asked, typing notes into her tablet. 7, maybe 8, the patient said. Henry checked the vitals he'd just taken, then quietly moved to the bedside. He watched the patient's face for a moment, noted the position he was holding, the slight guarding of his abdomen, the way his breathing changed when he shifted. Amanda, Henry said quietly, you might want to call the attending. She looked up from her tablet, slightly irritated at the interruption. I just started the assessment, Henry. I'll call when I'm ready. This one shouldn't wait. I appreciate your input, but I've got this. Her tone was professional, but dismissive. The voice of someone who'd learned to set boundaries with overeager support staff who thought their experience entitled them to make clinical judgments. Henry nodded and moved on. It wasn't his place to push. He'd learned that early in his tenure at St. Catherine's. The hospital had protocols, hierarchies, and scope of practice rules that were strictly enforced. He was a tech, not a clinician, and offering medical opinions was outside his lane. But 20 minutes later, when the patient in room 7 suddenly deteriorated, blood pressure dropping, abdomen rigid, and the attending rushed in to order an emergency CT that revealed a ruptured appendix, Henry was standing nearby with the crash cart already positioned, IV supplies laid out, and a knowing look in his eyes that Amanda tried very hard to ignore. The morning continued with the usual chaos of a busy ER, chest pain, broken bones, respiratory distress, the endless parade of human fragility. Henry moved through it all with practiced ease, always seeming to be in the right place at the right time, always having the right equipment ready before anyone asked. During a brief lull around 10 a.m., the nursing staff gathered at the central station. Amanda was still smarting from the appendicitis case, and when one of the other nurses asked what happened, she launched into the story with obvious frustration. So this patient comes in with abdominal pain, and I'm doing my assessment, completely by the book, and Henry decides he needs to interrupt and tell me to call the attending immediately. Like, I just started the assessment. I haven't even finished my history. What was wrong with the patient? Asked James Rodriguez, a nurse in his 30s with 10 years of ER experience. Ruptured appendix. But that's not the point. The point is, he's a tech. He can't be making those calls. We have protocols. We have assessment procedures. We have a whole system for a reason. But he was right, James pointed out. This time. But what if he's wrong next time? What if I start taking clinical direction from support staff and something goes wrong? I'm the one with the license. I'm the one responsible. I'm the one who gets sued. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the attending physicians, had been listening from her position at a computer terminal. She swiveled her chair to face the group. For what it's worth, Henry's instincts are usually solid. In the 18 months he's been here, I can't think of a single time he's flagged something that turned out to be nothing. That's kind of the problem, Amanda said. He acts like he knows more than we do, and maybe he's had some first aid training or whatever. But this is a hospital, not a battlefield. We have diagnostic tools, lab work, imaging. We don't have to rely on gut feelings and old-school techniques. Henry appeared at that moment, carrying a tray of supplies to restock one of the code carts. The conversation died awkwardly, and several nurses found sudden interest in their computer screens. Henry gave no indication he'd heard anything, just methodically replaced expired medications and checked equipment with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. After he'd moved on, James spoke up again. You know he was a combat medic, right? Vietnam, I think. Maybe other places too. That's why he's so good at reading situations. That was 50 years ago, Amanda countered. Medicine's changed. We have evidence-based practice now, standardized protocols, technology. Combat medicine is completely different from emergency medicine. Is it, though? Dr. Mitchell asked thoughtfully. I mean, the circumstances are different, obviously. But triage, rapid assessment, working under pressure with limited resources, those skills translate. With all due respect, Dr. Mitchell, we're not in a war zone. We have CT scanners and lab tests and specialty consultants. We don't need to rely on someone's gut feeling when we can get actual data. Dr. Mitchell smiled slightly. Fair enough, but don't dismiss experience too quickly, Amanda. Sometimes the old ways exist because they work. The shift continued through lunch and into the afternoon. Henry worked steadily, never complaining, never pushing back when nurses corrected him or redirected his efforts to tasks more appropriate for his role. He checked vitals, transported patients, cleaned rooms, stocked supplies. But those who paid attention noticed patterns, the way he could spot subtle changes in a patient's condition before the monitors caught them, how he anticipated needs before they were voiced. The efficiency of his movements, never wasted, never rushed, always precisely what the situation required. Around 3 p.m., a middle-aged woman came in via ambulance. Motorcycle accident, multiple injuries. The trauma team swarmed, and Henry moved to assist. As nurses worked to establish IV access in arms damaged by road rash, Henry quietly suggested trying the external jugular. When they had trouble immobilizing a suspected spinal injury with standard protocols, Henry showed them a technique using rolled blankets that provided better stabilization with the materials at hand. Each suggestion was offered quietly, without insistence, easily dismissed if the clinical staff preferred their own methods. But each suggestion also worked, improved outcomes, made the trauma response more efficient. Where did you learn that? One of the trauma nurses asked after the patient had been stabilized and moved to surgery. Field medicine, Henry said simply. When you don't have all the right equipment, you learn to improvise. Must have been some field work. Henry didn't respond, just began cleaning up the trauma bay with the same quiet efficiency, removing bloody materials, restocking supplies, preparing the space for the next emergency that would inevitably come. Later, during afternoon break, Amanda found James in the staff room. Okay, I'll admit it. Some of Henry's techniques are actually pretty clever. But why does he work here as a tech? If he's got all this medical knowledge, why not become a nurse? Or a paramedic? Why take the lowest position in the department? James shrugged. I asked him once. He said he'd had enough responsibility for several lifetimes, that he just wanted to help people without carrying the weight of decisions anymore. Seemed like there was a story there, but he didn't elaborate. So what? He's overqualified and underemployed by choice? Seems like it. Dr. Mitchell tried to get him to consider nursing school, told him we'd sponsor his education, but he declined. Said he was exactly where he needed to be. Amanda considered this, trying to square the image of the quiet, deferential tech with someone who possessed clinical knowledge that sometimes exceeded her own. It's frustrating. Like, I want to learn from him, but he won't teach. He just does things, and then moves on. Maybe that's the point, James said. Maybe he's done teaching. Maybe he's just trying to serve quietly and not carry the burden anymore. They returned to the floor as the afternoon stretched into evening. The ER was moderately busy. Nothing overwhelming, just the steady flow of human crisis that was normal for a Tuesday. Henry continued his rounds, checking vitals, noting changes, positioning himself where he might be needed before anyone realized they needed him. At 6:47 p.m., everything changed. The first call came through dispatch, multi-vehicle accident on I-65, multiple casualties en route. Then a second call. The accident involved a charter bus, a semi-truck, and at least 6 passenger vehicles. Mass casualty incident. 15 to 20 patients incoming. The overhead page crackled to life. Mass casualty protocol. All available staff to emergency department. Mass casualty protocol. The department erupted into controlled chaos. Clearing beds, calling in off-duty staff, setting up triage areas, preparing for an influx that would overwhelm their normal capacity. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, but there was tension in their movements, uncertainty in their eyes. Mass casualty protocols were something they drilled for, but rarely experienced in reality. Henry stood very still for a moment, and something changed in his bearing. The deferential tech disappeared, replaced by someone else, someone older, harder, carrying weight that suddenly became visible. Then he moved, and everyone in his path instinctively stepped aside. ACT-2. The first ambulances arrived 8 minutes after the initial call. Paramedics brought in patients on backboards, calling out vital signs and injuries in rapid-fire succession. The trauma bays filled immediately, and overflow patients were directed to the main ER area, where nurses scrambled to assess, prioritize, and stabilize. Henry moved through the chaos with purpose, but he wasn't following standard protocol anymore. He was doing something else, something that looked like triage but felt different, more instinctive, more ruthlessly efficient. He stopped at the first gurney, a woman with a head laceration, conscious and crying. One glance, rapid check of pupils and motor response. Minor, room 12, next. Second gurney, a man with obvious deformity to his left leg, in pain but stable vitals. Delayed, room 15, next. Third gurney, a teenager, pale, breathing rapid and shallow, abdomen distended. Henry's hands moved across the abdomen, feeling, pressing. Immediate, trauma, 2, internal bleeding, likely splenic rupture, move now. Amanda was standing nearby, frozen, watching Henry transform from the quiet tech into something else entirely. Dr. Mitchell appeared at her elbow. Help him, he knows what he's doing. But he's not. Right now, he's the most experienced triage officer in this building. Help him. Amanda moved to Henry's side as the next patient arrived. Henry's hands were already moving, checking pulses, examining wounds, making rapid assessments that took Amanda minutes to accomplish. Compound fracture, radial artery intact, delayed, room 16. How can you tell the artery's intact without color, warmth, capillary refill? Watch. He pressed the patient's fingertip, showed her the rapid return of pink. Delayed means they can wait. Focus on immediate threats, hemorrhage, airway, breathing. Everything else is noise. More ambulances, more patients. The department was filling past capacity, hallway beds deployed. Family waiting area converted to treatment space. Nurses were struggling with the volume, getting bogged down in proper assessment procedures, documentation requirements, the careful systematic approach they'd been trained to follow. Henry was doing something different. He was making split-second decisions based on pattern recognition honed over decades, not just of training, but of actual combat medicine, where hesitation meant death and perfect documentation was irrelevant if the patient didn't survive. Amanda, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. Stop trying to do complete assessments. Right now, you're sorting, critical or not critical. Everything else can wait. Look, listen, feel. 30 seconds per patient, maximum. But the protocols assume normal volume with adequate resources. We don't have that right now. We have 20 patients and they're still coming. You triage fast, or people die waiting for their turn. His eyes locked on hers. Trust me, I've done this before. Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the weight of experience, made Amanda nod. Okay, show me. They moved to the next patient together. Henry's assessment was ruthless in its efficiency. Airway clear? Yes. Breathing adequate? Yes. Major bleeding? No. Alert and oriented? Yes. Delayed category? Move to hallway bed. Next patient. Airway compromised? Yes. Position airway. His hands moved to jaw thrust position, opening the airway. Breathing restored. Immediate category, needs intubation, trauma. 1. Next patient. Unresponsive, no pulse, obvious fatal injuries, expectant category. Amanda stopped. Expectant? You mean? I mean, we can't save them, and trying would cost resources that could save 3 other patients. Cover them, mark them, move on. Henry's voice was flat, emotionless, but his hand briefly touched the deceased patient's shoulder, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, gone in an instant. This is the hardest part, but it's necessary. More patients. Henry moving through them like a machine, Amanda struggling to keep up, but beginning to understand the brutal logic of field triage. Not about perfect care for everyone, about maximum survival for the greatest number. James joined them, his more extensive experience helping him adapt faster to Henry's system. Jesus, Henry, where did you learn this? K. San, 1968, Henry said without stopping his work. Da Nang, 1970. Mogadishu, 1993. Every place where the wounded outnumbered the medical personnel, and you had to decide who lived and who died based on calculations that would haunt you forever. He moved to the next patient, a child, maybe 8 years old, bleeding from multiple lacerations but conscious and crying. Henry's hands gentled slightly, his voice softening. "Hey there, brave one. I know it hurts. We're going to fix you up." To James, that's delayed category, but watch for shock. Kids compensate until they don't. Then they crash fast. The flood continued. More ambulances, more patients. The department pushed beyond its surge capacity. Nurses were starting to show signs of stress, decision fatigue, the paralysis that came from too many choices and insufficient resources. Some were spending too long on individual patients, getting bogged down. Others were rushing, missing critical details in their haste. Henry seemed to be everywhere at once, not treating patients but directing traffic, making the hard calls, keeping the system moving. When a nurse froze trying to decide between two patients who both needed immediate attention, Henry appeared at her shoulder. "The one with decreased breath sounds on the left. Pneumothorax. Treat that one first. The other has time." When she hesitated, uncertain. "I'm telling you, not asking. Trust the voice of experience and move." She moved. Dr. Mitchell was working in Trauma 1, hands deep in a chest cavity trying to control bleeding, when Henry appeared with 2 units of O-negative blood. "You're going to need these in about 90 seconds. "How did you—" Mechanism of injury, vital trends, amount of blood on the scene, pattern recognition. "You'll call for it in 90 seconds, but we don't have 90 seconds to wait for it to arrive from blood bank. It's here now." 90 seconds later, the patient's pressure bottomed out, and Dr. Mitchell was calling for blood before she remembered Henry had already placed it at her elbow. She looked up to thank him, but he was gone, moving to the next crisis. The chaos continued for hours, 43 patients total from the accident scene, plus the normal flow of ER patients that didn't stop just because there was a mass casualty event. The department was stretched to breaking point, nurses exhausted, resources depleted, everyone running on adrenaline and training. Henry never stopped moving, never showed fatigue, operating with a mechanical efficiency that was almost frightening. But those who watched closely saw the cost in his eyes, the weight accumulating, the memories surfacing, the toll of making triage decisions that meant some people would wait and might die waiting. Around midnight, the flow finally slowed. The last critical patient was stabilized and moved to surgery. The delayed patients had been assessed and treated. The minor injuries had been handled. The expectant category, 3 patients who hadn't survived their injuries, had been moved to the morgue with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed. The department looked like a war zone, blood on the floors, equipment scattered, exhausted staff leaning against walls or sitting in chairs with 1,000-yard stares. But every patient who could be saved had been saved. The triage system, brutal as it was, had worked. Amanda found Henry in the supply room, restocking the trauma cart with trembling hands. His face was pale, his breathing carefully controlled, and when he dropped a medication vial, she saw that his hands were shaking. "Henry?" He didn't turn around. "I'm fine, just need a minute." "You're not fine." She moved closer, touched his shoulder gently. "What you did out there, that was extraordinary. You saved lives, probably a dozen or more, just by keeping the system moving, making the hard calls. You should be proud." "Proud," Henry repeated, his voice hollow. "I condemned 3 people to death because treating them would have cost resources I needed elsewhere. I made a child wait in pain because there were worse injuries to handle first. I turned this emergency department into a battlefield triage station because that's the only thing I know how to do when the casualties pile up." "You did what was necessary." "That's what they always say." His hands had stilled on the supplies, but he still wouldn't look at her. Necessary, required, the hard choices. But the children still scream and the dying still die. And you're still the one who decided they weren't worth the resources. That's what field medicine is, Amanda. That's what I brought to your nice, clean, protocol-driven emergency department. You brought survival. You brought experience that nobody else here had. I brought war. Now he did turn, and his eyes were raw with something Amanda had never seen before. Not just sadness, but an ancient grief, a weight accumulated over decades. I spent 50 years trying to leave that behind, trying to be just a tech, just support staff, just someone who helps without having to make the decisions. And then tonight happened, and I became that person again. The one who sorts human beings into categories like, there's supplies to be rationed. Act to throw. They sat in the supply room together, the chaos of the department muted by the closed door. Amanda wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the pain in Henry's eyes, but she was beginning to understand that some wounds didn't heal. They just learned to stay quiet most of the time. "Tell me," she said finally. "Help me understand what this costs." Henry was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped together to stop their shaking. When he spoke, his voice was distant, caught somewhere between the present and decades past. Quezon, January 1968. I was 20 years old, assigned to a Marine unit during the siege. We had a battalion aid station, supposed to be for stabilization before medevac. But the NVA had us surrounded, and helicopters couldn't always get through, so wounded just accumulated. He closed his eyes, seeing something Amanda couldn't. We'd have 50, 60 casualties waiting, and maybe 3 doctors, a handful of corpsmen. You couldn't treat everyone properly. You had to choose, immediate, delayed, or expectant. Same categories I used tonight, same brutal logic. There was a Marine, kid named Daniels, 19 years old, from Ohio. Took shrapnel to the abdomen and chest, bleeding internally, going into shock. He needed surgery, needed blood, needed resources we couldn't spare because there were 20 other guys who could survive with less. So I put him in expectant, gave him morphine, held his hand, told him he was going to be okay, and then moved on to the next patient. Henry's voice broke slightly. He took 4 hours to die. 4 hours of knowing he'd been abandoned, that he wasn't worth saving, that the system had categorized him as too expensive. And I was the one who made that call. 20 years old, playing God, deciding who lived and died based on nothing but probability and resource management. Amanda felt her throat tighten. You were doing your job, following the protocols. That's what I told myself. For years, that's what I told myself. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I could have tried to save him, could have diverted resources, could have fought harder, could have refused to accept that some people weren't worth the effort. But I didn't. I followed the protocol, made the logical choice, and let a kid die because saving him might have cost other lives. That's exactly what happened. And it happened again in Da Nang, and again in the Gulf, and again in Somalia. Different wars, different wounded, same impossible choices. Every time, I told myself it was necessary, that I was maximizing survival, that field triage required brutal efficiency. He opened his eyes, looked at Amanda directly. But every one of those faces stayed with me. Every name, every time I said expectant and moved on. They're all still there. James appeared at the door, Dr. Mitchell behind him. They'd been looking for Henry, drawn by concern and the sense that something important was happening in the supply room. "Henry," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "the hospital administrator wants to talk to you, the nursing supervisor too. They want to understand what happened tonight, how you managed to coordinate triage so effectively." "I didn't coordinate," Henry said tiredly. "I just reverted to type. Became what I was trained to be." "You saved lives," James said firmly. "I've been an ER nurse for 10 years, thought I understood triage. But what you did tonight, the speed, the accuracy, the way you kept the whole system moving, that was mastery. That was someone who'd done it before, under conditions worse than anything we'll ever see." "Somalia," Henry said quietly. 1993, after the Black Hawk Down incident. They brought us over 100 casualties in 4 hours. Mogadishu Airport had been turned into a field hospital, and we had maybe a dozen medical personnel. I was 45 years old, had been working private sector, thought I was done with military medicine, but they needed experienced combat medics, so I went. He stood slowly, steadying himself against the shelf. The wounded just kept coming, special operators, rangers, helicopter crews, local civilians caught in the crossfire. We ran out of blood, out of supplies, out of time, and I stood there triaging, sorting, deciding who got the limited resources and who didn't. There was a ranger, Sergeant Martinez, took a round through the liver, bleeding out, needed immediate surgery. But we had 2 surgeons working on 5 other patients, and making room for Martinez meant letting one of those others wait. So I had to calculate. Was Martinez more likely to survive than the patient currently on the table? Was his injury more salvageable? Was he worth diverting resources? Henry's face was pale, his voice barely above a whisper. I made the call. Moved Martinez to immediate, bumped another patient to delayed. Martinez survived. The other patient, a young Somali boy, maybe 14, caught in crossfire, bled out waiting for surgery. I saved one life by accepting another death. That's field medicine. That's what I brought to your department tonight. Dr. Mitchell moved closer, her expression compassionate but firm. Henry, you're describing triage exactly as it's meant to function. Maximum survival for the greatest number. It's not about individual perfect care. It's about system optimization when resources are inadequate. You didn't kill anyone. You made the best decisions possible with impossible circumstances. Does that make the faces go away? Henry asked simply. Does that stop the names from echoing in your head at 3 a.m.? Because I've been carrying them for 53 years, and the logic never made them lighter. Amanda stood, moved to Henry's side. But you kept serving anyway. After all that, after all the weight you were carrying, you kept showing up. You're here now, working as a tech, helping patients, doing the work without the recognition. Why? Henry looked at her, and for the first time that night, something like a sad smile touched his face. Because the alternative was giving up, letting the weight win, deciding that if I couldn't save everyone, I wouldn't save anyone. He gestured toward the door, toward the department beyond where lives had been saved tonight. I can't undo the past, can't bring back Daniels or Martinez or any of the others, but I can show up, can use what I learned to help the people in front of me right now. That's all any of us can do, carry the weight and keep moving forward. James spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. Henry, I need to apologize. We all do. We dismissed your experience, treated you like you were just support staff, didn't recognize what you brought to this department. Tonight, you saved lives that would have been lost if we'd stuck strictly to our protocols. You taught us something we couldn't have learned any other way. I didn't teach, Henry said. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what teaching is, Dr. Mitchell said. Demonstration under pressure. You showed us that protocols are guidelines, not laws. That experience and instinct have value even in an era of evidence-based medicine. That sometimes the old ways work because they were forged in circumstances harder than anything we can imagine. Henry closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he seemed to have come to some decision. All right, if you really want to learn, I'll teach. Not because I think my way is better, but because field medicine and emergency medicine need to inform each other. You need to know how to function when systems break down, when resources are inadequate, when perfect care isn't possible. Because mass casualty events don't wait for ideal circumstances. We'd appreciate that, Dr. Mitchell said, more than you know. But I have conditions, Henry continued. First, you understand that what I teach comes with weight. Field triage means making decisions that will haunt you. If you're not ready for that burden, you should stay with standard protocols. Understood, Amanda said, and James nodded beside her. Second, you recognize that my techniques are supplements, not replacements. Modern medicine is miraculous, and you should use every tool available. But when those tools aren't enough, when the system breaks down, you need fallback skills. That's what I can teach. Agreed, Dr. Mitchell said. And third, Henry's voice softened slightly. You remember that every patient in expectant category is a person, a human being with a name and a story, and people who love them. The system requires us to make brutal choices sometimes, but we never stop seeing the humanity. That's the price of this work. You have to care enough to carry the weight of every decision. The room was quiet. Then Amanda extended her hand. Thank you, Henry, for tonight, for what you're willing to teach us, for carrying all that weight for so many years. He shook her hand, his grip firm despite the earlier trembling. Thank you for listening, for understanding that experience and innovation aren't enemies, for being willing to learn from an old medic who's seen too much but can't stop trying to help. ACT 4. The weeks following the mass casualty event brought changes to St. Catherine's emergency department. Henry's role quietly evolved from patient care technician to something without an official title, but with undeniable importance, a mentor, a teacher, a living repository of field medicine knowledge. The nursing staff who'd previously dismissed his suggestions now sought them out. They asked questions about triage, about working under pressure, about reading patients without relying entirely on technology. Henry taught them in the same way he'd learned, through demonstration, through shared experience, through stories that carried lessons earned in circumstances they'd hopefully never face. One afternoon, 3 weeks later, Amanda found Henry in his usual spot, checking vitals on a patient in room 9. She waited until he'd finished, then pulled him aside. I need to show you something, she said, leading him to a small conference room where the hospital administration had set up a presentation. On the screen was data from the night of the mass casualty event, patient outcomes, mortality rates, efficiency metrics, comparisons to regional averages for similar incidents. The numbers were remarkable. Despite being overwhelmed, despite inadequate resources, St. Catherine's had achieved survival rates 15% higher than comparable facilities facing similar events. This is because of you, Amanda said. Your triage system, your efficiency, your decision-making. The administrator is using this as a case study. wants to incorporate your methods into our mass casualty protocols. Henry studied the numbers with mixed feelings. These are just statistics. They don't show the faces, don't carry the names. No, Amanda agreed. But they show lives saved, families intact, people who got second chances because someone with experience knew how to manage the impossible. That matters, Henry. Your experience matters. The hospital had approved a new position, mass casualty coordinator, and wanted Henry to fill it. It came with a significant pay increase, official authority, and the responsibility of training staff on disaster response protocols. Henry had declined. I appreciate the offer, he'd told the administrator, but I'm exactly where I need to be. I can teach from any position. The title doesn't matter. What did matter was the small group that gathered Thursday evenings in the conference room, nurses, techs, even some physicians, who wanted to learn field medicine from someone who'd practiced it in the worst possible conditions. Henry taught them triage, improvisation, rapid assessment, working with limited resources. But more than techniques, he taught philosophy. The mindset required to function when everything was falling apart, when there were no good choices, only choices that minimized harm. The emotional resilience to make decisions that would haunt you and then get up the next day and do it again. The humanity required to see patients as people, even when the system forced you to categorize them as resources. Marcus, a young nurse fresh out of school, asked during one session, "How do you live with it? The decisions, the weight, knowing you can't save everyone?" Henry was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You don't live with it easily. Every name stays with you, every face. Every time you said expectant or delayed and knew that decision might cost a life. But you also remember the ones who survived because you made the hard call, because you kept the system moving, because you didn't freeze or give up." He looked around the room at the young faces watching him, people who'd chosen medical careers to help others, who'd hopefully never faced the extremes he'd experienced, but needed to be prepared just in case. "The trick is balance," Henry continued. "You acknowledge the weight without letting it stop you. You honor the dead by fighting for the living. You remember that perfect care for one person might mean no care for 3 others. And sometimes the ethical choice is the utilitarian one, even when it breaks your heart." "And when it becomes too much?" asked Sarah, an experienced trauma nurse who'd worked the mass casualty night. "Then you find ways to serve that don't require carrying the weight of decisions. That's why I work as a tech. I can help without having to make the choices that cost pieces of your soul. But even in that role, the knowledge stays with you, available when needed, like tonight." The sessions continued through the spring. Henry taught, answered questions, shared stories that illustrated principles. But he also learned about modern trauma care, about technologies that hadn't existed during his combat medicine days, about evidence-based practices that could supplement field experience. The relationship between old and new medicine began to feel less like conflict and more like synthesis. Henry's experience informed the staff's understanding of disaster response, while their modern training updated his techniques with current best practices. Neither approach was complete without the other. One evening, James approached Henry after a training session. "My son's joining the Army as a combat medic. He ships out in 2 months. Would you be willing to talk to him? Give him some advice from someone who's been there?" Henry met with James's son Alex a week later. They sat in a coffee shop near the hospital, the young man eager and nervous and impossibly young to Henry's eyes. "Your dad said you could tell me what it's really like," Alex said. "The stuff they don't teach in training." Henry sipped his coffee, considering. "The technical skills matter. Learn them, practice them until they're reflexive. But the part that will define your service isn't the techniques, it's the decisions. When you have more casualties than you can handle, when resources are limited, when there's no right answer, only choices that minimize harm. How do you make those choices? You do the math. You assess who can survive with treatment versus who can't be saved regardless of treatment. You prioritize airway, breathing, circulation. You move fast, trust your training, and accept that you can't save everyone." Henry met Alex's eyes. "And then, you live with it. The faces stay with you. The names, the ones who died because you didn't have enough time or supplies or hands. That's the cost." Alex swallowed hard. "That's terrifying." "It is. But here's what else. You'll also remember the ones who survived because you showed up, because you made the hard calls and kept fighting even when it seemed hopeless. You'll carry letters from families thanking you for bringing their son or daughter or husband home alive. Those don't erase the weight, but they make it bearable. Any other advice? Yes. Remember that combat medicine is temporary. You serve your time, you do your duty, and then you come home. And when you come home, Find ways to keep serving that don't require carrying the full weight of command decisions. Help people, but let others make the hard calls. You'll have earned that peace. They talked for 2 hours, Henry sharing wisdom earned through decades and multiple conflicts, Alex absorbing it with the seriousness of someone who understood he was being given something valuable. When they parted, Alex shook Henry's hand with profound respect. "Thank you, sir. If I can be half the medic you were, I'll consider my service successful." "Just come home," Henry said simply. "Survive your service, help as many as you can, and then come home and build a life. That's the real success." 6 months after the mass casualty event, St. Catherine's held a ceremony recognizing staff who'd responded that night. Henry was included, though he'd tried to decline the recognition. The hospital CEO gave a speech about extraordinary performance under pressure, about staff who'd exceeded expectations, about a response that had saved lives through skill and dedication. Then she called Henry to the front. Henry Garrett served as a combat medic for over 30 years in multiple conflicts. He brought that experience to our facility, working quietly as a patient care tech, helping without seeking recognition. But when crisis came, his experience and leadership were instrumental in achieving outcomes that exceeded regional standards. We are grateful for his service, both to our country and to this hospital. The applause was genuine and sustained. Henry accepted a plaque with quiet dignity, said a few words of thanks, and tried to return to his seat. But the nursing staff had other ideas. Amanda, James, and a dozen others stood, pulling him into embraces, expressing gratitude that went beyond professional courtesy into genuine affection. "You changed how we practice," Amanda told him. "Not just the techniques, but the mindset. You taught us to think differently about crisis care." "You were already good," Henry said. "I just showed you some things you hadn't seen before." Later, after the ceremony, Henry returned to the emergency department. His shift was starting, and there were patients who needed vitals checked, supplies that needed stocking, 100 small tasks that kept the system running. He gathered his equipment and began his rounds, moving through the department with the same quiet efficiency, the same attention to detail, the same understanding that every patient mattered regardless of their position in the triage hierarchy. In room 12, he found an elderly veteran in for chest pain, wearing a faded army jacket with patches from Vietnam. Henry checked his vitals, noted the good strong pulse, the adequate oxygen saturation. Then he saw the patch, 1st Cavalry Division, Ia Drang Valley. "You were at Ia Drang?" Henry asked quietly. The veteran looked up, recognition sparking in his eyes, the way veterans knew each other, even decades later. "November 65? You? Medic, various units, various places, different times, same war." They talked for a few minutes, the kind of conversation civilians couldn't follow, references to places and events that existed in memory more than official history. When Henry finished the vitals check and prepared to move on, the veteran caught his arm. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for now, for then. For all the medics who ran toward the fire instead of away from it. We knew you were there, knew you'd come if we went down. That knowledge saved lives just by being true." Henry nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. That knowledge saved lives just by being true. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. He continued his rounds, moving through the department, checking patients, helping where needed. Just a tech, officially, but carrying knowledge earned through decades of serving in the worst circumstances imaginable. Carrying weight that would never fully lift, but had learned to settle into something bearable. Carrying forward a tradition of showing up, of doing the work, of helping one patient at a time, regardless of recognition or reward. Because someone had to. Because the wounded still needed care. Because service didn't end when the uniform came off. Because the knowledge, the skills, the hard-won wisdom, those were meant to be passed forward, shared, used to help the next generation face crises they hopefully would never encounter, but needed to be prepared for just in case. Henry Garrett, 71 years old, patient care technician, combat veteran, keeper of field medicine wisdom, continued his work, quietly, efficiently, with the same attention to every detail that had defined 53 years of medical service. The weight remained, the faces, the names, the impossible decisions. But so did the survivors. The lives saved, the knowledge passed forward, the tradition maintained, and that, in the end, was enough. Closing St. Catherine's Regional Medical Center sits on the west side of Indianapolis, its emergency department handling the endless flow of human crisis with modern efficiency and technology. But if you look carefully on certain shifts, you'll find an elderly man in navy blue scrubs, checking vitals, stocking supplies, moving through the department with practiced ease. Henry Garrett is 74 now, still working 3 shifts a week, still teaching Thursday evening sessions to staff who want to learn field medicine from someone who lived it. His hands shake more than they used to, and he moves a bit slower, but his eyes still catch the subtle changes that monitors miss. His instincts still spot patterns that protocols don't account for. The nursing staff treats him differently now, not as a tech who's overstepping boundaries, but as a mentor whose experience bridges the gap between textbook medicine and crisis reality. When codes get hectic, when multiple patients arrive simultaneously, when the system strains under unexpected demand, nurses look for Henry. Not to take over, but to steady the ship, to provide the calm certainty that comes from having functioned in far worse circumstances and survived. Amanda Chen is a charge nurse now, having completed additional training in trauma and emergency care. She still thinks about that night, the mass casualty event that transformed her understanding of what medicine could be when systems broke down. She teaches new nurses to respect experience, to understand that modern protocols are built on foundations laid by people like Henry in circumstances no one should have to face. Technology is a tool, she tells them, but wisdom comes from experience. Never dismiss someone's knowledge because their methods seem outdated. The old ways often exist because they work, because they were forged in fire, because they've been tested in ways you hope you'll never experience. James Rodriguez took a position with the hospital's Disaster Preparedness Committee, working to incorporate Henry's field medicine principles into official protocols. Mass casualty training now includes improvisation techniques, rapid triage methods, and the psychological preparation for making decisions under impossible circumstances. Marcus, the young nurse who'd asked about living with the weight, specialized in trauma nursing and completed additional training in military medicine. He corresponds with Alex, James's son, who's serving as a combat medic in the Middle East. They exchange letters about techniques, decisions, the reality of practicing medicine in war zones. Marcus shares what Henry taught him, passing forward the wisdom one generation at a time. The Thursday evening sessions continue, growing in attendance. Nurses, paramedics, even physicians attend to learn from a man who practiced combat medicine in an era before modern technology, when improvisation and instinct were the primary tools available. Henry teaches them triage, yes, but also resilience. How to function when everything is falling apart. How to carry the weight of decisions. How to honor the dead by fighting for the living. He shows them his scars sometimes, physical and otherwise. Talks about Khe Sanh and Da Nang and Mogadishu and all the places in between. Names the fallen he still remembers, still carries, still honors through continued service. And he teaches them that the weight doesn't go away, but it can be balanced by the lives saved, the knowledge shared, the tradition maintained. Dr. Sarah Mitchell retired last year, but still stops by the department occasionally. She finds Henry in his usual spots, checking vitals, stocking supplies, helping where needed. They have coffee in the break room and talk about medicine, about the balance between protocol and instinct, about honoring tradition while embracing innovation. "You know what your real legacy is?" she asked him once. "It's not the lives you saved in combat, though those matter. It's not the patients you've helped here, though that matters too. It's the knowledge you've passed forward, the nurses who think differently because of what you taught them, the protocols that now account for field medicine principles, the understanding that experience has value even in an age of technology." Henry nodded slowly. "I hope so, because the names I carry, Daniels, Martinez, all the others, they deserve to mean something. They deserve to have died for a tradition that survives, that continues, that helps future generations." "They did," Dr. Mitchell assured him, "because you're still here, still teaching, still passing it forward." The emergency department continues its work. Ambulances arrive, patients flow through, lives are saved or lost based on skill, technology, and sometimes the accumulated wisdom of someone who learned medicine in circumstances that forged mastery through absolute necessity. And in quiet moments, between patients, during lulls in the chaos, Henry Garrett stands in the supply room or at the nurse's station, and he remembers the faces, the names, the decisions, the weight. But he also remembers the survivors, the letters from families, the reunions of soldiers who lived because someone knew how to sort casualties under fire, the young nurses who now carry forward some piece of the knowledge he shared, the tradition maintained through teaching, through demonstration, through the simple act of showing up and helping one patient at a time. At 74, Henry knows his time is finite. The hands shake more, the back aches longer, the exhaustion takes deeper root, But he also knows the tradition will survive. He's made sure of it. Through teaching, through mentoring, through creating space for field medicine wisdom to inform modern practice. Marcus will carry it forward. Amanda will carry it forward. James's son Alex will come home eventually and carry it forward in his own way. The chain remains unbroken, the knowledge preserved, the hard-won lessons of combat medicine still available for the next mass casualty event, the next crisis, the next impossible situation where someone needs to know how to function when systems fail and decisions carry life or death weight. That's the legacy. Not awards or recognition or titles, just knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, forged in fire and shared in service. Just the weight, distributed across many shoulders instead of borne alone. Just the understanding that some things can't be taught through textbooks or simulations, only through demonstration and shared experience, and the willingness of old warriors to say, "This is what I learned, this is what cost, this is how you carry it forward." Henry Garrett continues his work, checking vitals, stocking supplies, teaching Thursday evenings, carrying names and faces and decisions that will stay with him until his last breath, but also carrying forward a tradition that predates modern medicine, that exists in the space where human need exceeds available resources, where someone has to make the hard calls, where experience matters more than credentials. The tradition of field medicine, of combat care, of showing up when the casualties pile up and doing what needs doing, regardless of cost, regardless of weight, regardless of the toll it takes, because someone has to. Because the wounded need care, because knowledge earned through suffering deserves to serve future generations, because service never truly ends. It just changes form, adapts to circumstances, finds new ways to help. Henry Garrett, 74 years old, patient care technician, combat medic, teacher, keeper of traditions, carrier of weight, walks through St. Catherine's emergency department with steady purpose. The faces still haunt him, the names still echo, the decisions still weigh, but he keeps walking, keeps helping, keeps teaching, keeps passing it forward, one patient at a time, one lesson at a time, one generation at a time, forever. End for all who serve in silence and all who carry the weight so others don't have to.